Summer 1943, Texas. The air shimmered with heat, and the barbed wire around Camp Hearn glowed like molten thread under the noon sun. Beyond it stretched endless wheat fields, golden and whispering, a freedom close enough to see, too far to touch. Inside the fences, hundreds of men in faded gray uniforms stood in quiet lines, their boots sinking into dust that smelled faintly of cattle and sweat. They had crossed an ocean as soldiers of the Reich and arrived as prisoners of the United States. Lieutenant Robert Hayes watched them from the shade of a barracks post, his hat tilted low. Before the war, he'd been a history teacher who believed the world's lessons came in books, not bullets. Yet here he was, guarding men barely older than his former students. Some whistled softly, others stared at the ground as if still marching somewhere in their minds. "You'd think they were on vacation," a private muttered. Hayes didn't answer. He saw something different, an exhaustion so deep it made even the proud look humble. One of the newcomers caught his eye, a tall, sandy-haired man with a bandaged hand and a calm gaze that neither flinched nor pleaded. His name tag read F. Keller. Later, Hayes would learn his full name. Friedrich Keller, once a Wehrmacht mechanic from Hamburg, now a man who folded his blanket with mathematical precision as if the act itself could restore order to a broken world. When Hayes called roll, Keller's English was halting but polite. "Yes, sir. I am here." His accent turned the words into music and apology at once. Camp Hearn wasn't what the Germans expected. The bunks were sturdy, the food plentiful, and the guards more curious than cruel. Some POWs joked that America had confused prison with paradise. But kindness was its own kind of weapon. It disarmed. Within weeks, the men were working in the wheat fields under contract, earning 50 cents a day for labor they once forced from others in occupied lands. To the townspeople of Hearn, it was a sight that blurred the lines between enemy and neighbor. German soldiers stooping in Texas dirt beside black sharecroppers and Mexican farmhands, sweating under the same merciless sky. At dusk, the air cooled and smelled of mesquite and coffee. The camp orchestra, assembled from captured band members, played old German folk songs that drifted across the prairie. Hayes sometimes paused by the fence to listen, torn between duty and sympathy. "They sound homesick," he told Sergeant Miller one evening. Miller spat. "They sound lucky." Fritz Keller wrote in his small notebook by lamplight each night, a habit from the front. "War," he wrote, "was loud. Defeat is quieter, but it lasts longer." He didn't understand these Americans who smiled while locking doors. One guard, a teenager with freckles, offered him a cigarette every morning as if they were friends in another life. Fritz always accepted. Courtesy cost nothing, and maybe he thought it could buy back something lost. In town, whispers grew. Housewives at the grocer's complained that their sons were dying overseas while the Nazis were being fed pie and peaches. Pastor Lewis Grant, an old man with gentle eyes, tried to calm them from the pulpit. "Mercy and victory," he preached, "is what separates us from what we fight." But even he wondered, watching the prisoners march two by two past his church windows, if mercy could survive the headlines from Europe. One August afternoon, a delivery truck broke down near the north fence. The driver, a local widow named Helen Carter, stood beside it, scolding the engine. Fritz, working nearby, asked permission to help. Hayes hesitated, then nodded. Within minutes, Fritz had fixed the problem with a twist of wire and a quiet confidence that made Helen blink twice. "You speak English?" she asked. "A little," he said, wiping his hands. "Enough for engines. Not for people." She laughed, short, unsure. When she drove away, she glanced in the mirror and saw him watching the horizon, not her. That night, she told her daughter, "They don't look like killers. Just men who ran out of somewhere to go." By September, the camp had developed its own rhythm. Work, meals, mail call, the evening whistle. The men built model ships, played chess, painted murals on barrack walls. One showed a mountain lake surrounded by pine trees. Another, a field of poppies where no one ever died. Hayes sometimes wondered if art could be a form of escape too. The guards teased him for reading the prisoners' poetry translations, but he couldn't help it. Their words held something pure and broken. like glass washed smooth by sea waves. The conflict that brewed wasn't between the guards and prisoners. It was between memory and mercy. The Germans carried guilt they couldn't name. The Americans carried anger they couldn't drop. The fence became both mirror and metaphor. Each side saw its reflection twisted in the other's eyes. One evening, a fight broke out between two POWs, one still loyal to Hitler, the other disgusted by him. Hayes intervened, pulling them apart. "You're safe here," he said, almost believing it himself. That night, Fritz wrote again. "I dreamed of my mother. She was baking bread. When I reached for it, my hands were empty." He tore the page out and buried it near the fence post the next morning. Autumn came early. The wheat turned brittle and silver under the wind, rattling like dry bones. The camp prepared for winter shipments, new prisoners from North Africa. Rumors said the Allies were pushing closer to Berlin. Some guards cheered. Fritz felt only shame. Hayes caught him staring west one evening and asked, "Thinking of home?" Fritz replied, "Of what's left of it." The two men shared coffee that night in silence, steam rising between them like a fragile truce. Hayes thought about his brother fighting in Italy, maybe staring at another fence, another prisoner. "Strange world," he said finally. "We feed the enemy better than some of our own folks back home." Fritz smiled faintly. "Maybe that is why you will win." Outside, the barbed wire gleamed under the moon, its shadows cutting across both their boots. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes howled, a song too wild for either side to claim. The next morning, a rumor swept through camp. Some of the POWs might be sent to local farms for seasonal harvest. Hayes worried what the townspeople would do, but orders were orders. As the men filed out, Fritz glanced back at the fence he'd lived behind for months. The sun caught on its metal strands, turning them into thin lines of fire. He thought of the word Heimat, home, and wondered if it was a place or a feeling, and if either still existed. Across the fields, Helen Carter watched the same men march past her porch on their way to work. She clutched her coffee cup and whispered, "Lord, help us see them as human." Her voice trembled, unsure if it was prayer or confession. And that night, as the camp orchestra began a slow waltz under the open sky, something in the air shifted. The melody wasn't quite German or American. It was something in between, born of dust, distance, and longing. Hayes listened from his quarters, heart unsettled. For the first time, he wondered whether fences were built to keep enemies out or to keep forgiveness in. Autumn came to Texas with winds that smelled faintly of smoke and ripe corn. The wheat fields had already surrendered their gold, leaving behind stubble that rustled like dry paper when the wind passed through. At Camp Hearn, the heat softened and the men began to write. They wrote to mothers in ruined towns, to wives they might never see again, to children who had forgotten their faces. Every evening, the clack of typewriters mixed with the scratching of pencils, a strange symphony of repentance and routine. The mailbags were heavy, letters bound for a continent in ashes. Friedrich Keller wrote more than most. His English had improved, learned through labor and laughter with the guards, and from old magazines traded among prisoners. "We build barns, we mend fences, and somehow," he wrote to his sister in Hamburg, "it feels like building pieces of ourselves again." He told her about the Americans' endless coffee, about the sky that looked too big to belong to any one nation. He described Lieutenant Hayes, the camp officer who treated them as men, not enemies. He asks questions as if he wants to understand, Fritz wrote. Perhaps that is America's greatest weapon, curiosity. Every morning before roll call, Hayes read the POWs' outgoing letters. Regulations demanded it. He never censored a word unless it gave away a military detail, but sometimes he paused, touched by a line too personal for war's bureaucracy. One letter read, "I dream that my children will never need to know which side I fought for." Another, "I am more afraid of kindness than bullets." Hayes folded them carefully, sealing them with a quiet respect. When the harvest season began, dozens of POWs were sent to local farms under supervision. The Carters were among the families who received help. Helen watched as two German men and a young woman climbed down from the army truck. The woman wore a nurse's armband, and carried herself like someone who once commanded chaos. Anna Schmidt, she introduced herself, her accent soft, her eyes wary. Helen's first instinct was fear, then pity. Anna was barely 23, with hands too fine for hard labor. They picked cotton together under a mild sun. Helen's daughter, Mary, a curious child of 12, asked endless questions in the kind of honesty only children possessed. "Do you miss your home?" she asked Anna. "Yes," Anna said, smiling faintly. "Even the parts one shouldn't." That night, Helen found Mary practicing German words by candlelight. When asked why, she said, so she can have someone to talk to. Letters continued to flow. Anna's went unanswered. Her parents were likely gone, her village bombed months before. Yet she wrote anyway, addressing each letter to an empty street. Hay sometimes saw her at the infirmary, tending to small injuries, humming lullabies from the old country. He once asked how she could care for others while knowing her own might be dead. She replied, "Mercy is the only thing they didn't take from me." The word stayed with him longer than he admitted. Tension began to grow beyond the camp. Some locals resented the German workers' presence, especially after telegrams arrived announcing more sons lost overseas. One morning, Hayes found a note pinned to the camp gate. "Why feed the devil when our own are starving?" He crumpled it and said nothing, but Helen noticed his silence when he came for weekly farm inspections. "People fear what they see through fences," she said. He nodded. "Or maybe they fear what the fences can't hide." For the prisoners, the Texas autumn was a season of contradictions. They worked among American families who smiled politely but flinched at their accents. They were paid in camp credits, used mostly for paper, ink, and soap. At night, they gathered around small stoves and shared news from home. Rumors, really, about the fall of cities, the retreat from Russia, the bombs over Hamburg. The men would go quiet, then someone would hum a hymn, and the others would join softly, voices blending into something fragile and forgiving. One afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled in without warning. The POWs working on the Carter farm took shelter in the barn. Rain hammered the tin roof, drowning out language itself. Mary brought out blankets and insisted on sharing bread. Helen hesitated, standing at the threshold, watching Fritz, who had joined the work crew that week, help repair a broken beam. His movements were patient, precise. "You fix everything like it can be saved," she said. He looked up, rain dripping from his hair. "Maybe it can." Later, Helen found him standing at the fence, staring into the gray fields. "When you go home," she asked quietly, "what will you tell them about this place?" He considered for a long moment. That kindness feels heavier than chains. By October, the first frost came. Letters from Germany grew fewer. Mail routes had collapsed under the advancing front. Some prisoners still wrote, though they knew their words would never reach anyone. Hayes watched as they sealed their envelopes anyway. He thought of them as prayers, sent to heaven with no address, but maybe still received. One evening, Anna handed him a folded paper. "For you," she said simply. It was a poem, translated awkwardly but beautifully. "The wheat bends not from fear, but from wind. The heart bends not from weakness, but from mercy. When the war is over, let us learn again how to kneel without surrender." He wanted to thank her, but found no words that wouldn't sound small. That night, he copied the poem into his journal, unsure if it was meant for him or for the world. The weeks that followed blurred into golden dusk and smoke from the camp kitchen. Thanksgiving neared, though the POWs didn't know the holiday. Helen invited the German workers to share a meal, just stew and cornbread, nothing fancy. The offer caused murmurs in town, but she ignored them. When Fritz sat at her table, he bowed his head as she prayed, though she never told him to. Afterward, he whispered, "We had a saying, 'He who shares bread shares peace.' Maybe we stole it from you." Helen smiled sadly. "Or maybe we both borrowed it from God." That night, Anna returned to camp with a small apple pie wrapped in cloth. The guards laughed, teasing Hayes for his lenience, but he only smiled. "Maybe it's a bribe," he said. "Maybe it's hope." Winter was coming. Rumors of Allied victory filled the radio waves. Some POWs began to dream of release. Others dreaded the ruins awaiting them. Fritz felt torn between two homes, one of soil, the other of mercy. He wrote his sister one last letter. If you receive this, know that not all Americans carried guns. Some carried grace. A week later, the mail to Germany was suspended indefinitely. The letters stopped leaving, and silence settled over the camp like early snow. The men still gathered by the fence at sunset, staring west, where the horizon burned red. Helen watched them sometimes, wondering what prayers they whispered in that strange language that sounded so much like sorrow. And on one quiet evening, as the last mail truck disappeared into the distance, Fritz pressed his final unsent letter into the dirt by the fence post, beside the one he had buried months before. Maybe the earth delivers what the sky cannot, he murmured. Hayes, watching from afar, couldn't hear the words, but he saw the gesture and felt the truth of it. The next morning, the camp loudspeaker crackled with an announcement that would change everything. Christmas volunteers needed. Local families willing to host POWs for one day only. Hayes froze mid-step, the echo of Anna's poem ringing in his head. Mercy, he thought, had just found its most dangerous form. Winter 1944 came without mercy. The Texas sky, once a burning canvas of gold, turned gray as tin, and frost glazed the camp fences until they gleamed like veins of glass. In Europe, the war's end drew nearer, though no one dared to say it aloud. Here, on this quiet stretch of American soil, something stranger than victory was taking shape. It began with a rumor, a whisper that some townsfolk wanted to invite the German prisoners to share Christmas dinner. Lieutenant Robert Hayes first heard it from Pastor Grant, whose wrinkled hands trembled as he poured coffee in the mess hall. If we can pray for our enemies, the pastor said, perhaps we can feed them too. Hayes stared at him, half stunned, half amused. You're serious? He asked. Grant nodded. Mercy must walk, Lieutenant. Otherwise, it's just another sermon. By December, the idea had spread beyond the church pews. A few families in Hearn, moved by a year of strange coexistence, offered to host 2 or 3 POWs each. Most townspeople called it madness. The local paper's headline read, Christmas with the enemy? Yet Helen Carter signed her name to the volunteer list before even consulting her conscience. She told Mary, if Christ can dine with sinners, I can manage supper with Germans. Her daughter grinned, half proud, half curious. When the camp command approved the experiment, Fritz Keller stood among those chosen. He didn't know whether to feel honored or terrified. For weeks, he had dreamed of his family in ruins, of a table with empty chairs. Now, by some strange twist, he was being offered another family's table, his enemies. Why us? He asked Hayes when his name appeared on the roster. Hayes shrugged. Because you're the least likely to make trouble. He paused, then added softly, and maybe the most likely to understand. The evening arrived crisp and brittle. Snow dusted the fields like flour, and the prisoners were given freshly pressed shirts and wool coats donated by local churches. A guard truck carried them down a narrow road lined with bare pecan trees. Fritz sat between 2 younger men, silent except for the rhythm of the tires. Through the frosted window, he saw distant porch lights glowing like constellations. It felt like traveling through another world, one where war had forgotten to exist. When Helen opened her door, warmth and the smell of roast chicken spilled out. Come in, she said, her voice steady but her eyes shining with nerves. Fritz stepped forward, removing his cap. Behind him, Anna Schmidt followed, clutching a small gift she'd made, a hand-sewn napkin embroidered with a cross. Helen took it with a trembling smile. That's lovely, dear. We'll put it right here. She placed it at the center of the table, as if it were a flag of truce. The meal began awkwardly. Knives and forks clinked too loudly. Mary stared openly at the guests until Helen nudged her knee. So, Helen said, her voice brittle, how do you say Merry Christmas in German? Fritz replied gently, Frohe Weihnachten. The words rolled from his tongue like music, softer than she expected. They repeated it after him, laughing at their clumsy pronunciation. The laughter broke the ice that even war couldn't hold. Over the meal, stories began to trade hands. Fritz described the North Sea's gray storms and his mother's rye bread. Helen spoke of drought years and the way her husband used to whistle through the house before he died. Anna asked about American winters, then confessed she'd never seen snow until now. Mary, fascinated, handed her a snowflake she'd caught on a mitten, whispering, "It melts like tears." Hayes arrived midway through dinner, checking that everything was peaceful. What he found disarmed him entirely. The Germans were laughing, honestly laughing, as Helen served second helpings of potatoes. Fritz was showing Mary how to fold a napkin into the shape of a bird. Anna was humming a tune so old it seemed to belong to both countries at once. Hayes lingered by the doorway, unsure whether to salute or sit down. Helen motioned him in. "Lieutenant, you might as well eat before the peace wears off." Later, they moved to the parlor where an old radio played faint carols. Fritz examined a framed photograph of Helen's late husband in uniform. "He fought in the First War," she said quietly. "He never learned to hate the Germans, either." Fritz bowed his head. Then perhaps he understood something we are only beginning to learn. The moment turned fragile. Helen's neighbor, Mr. Thompson, arrived unexpectedly, an older man whose son had been killed in Italy. Seeing the German uniforms, his face hardened. "This is what we're doing now," he spat. "Feeding them while our boys freeze to death overseas." The room went still. Helen rose, her voice calm but firm. "My son isn't home either, Tom. But if Mercy dies here, what's left for them to come back to?" Thompson trembled, then turned and walked out without a word. The silence that followed felt endless. Fritz finally spoke, voice low. "We don't deserve this kindness. You must know that." Helen looked at him, tears gathering. "Maybe not, but I give anyway, because someone has to start ending this war." Outside, snow thickened, softening the fences that divided the world. Mary fetched her violin and played Silent Night. Fritz and Anna joined in, singing in German. The languages wove together like threads in a single cloth. Hayes, watching, felt his throat tighten. The same carol, he realized, had once drifted across no man's land in 1914, when soldiers on both sides laid down their guns for one holy night. History was circling back, offering redemption in the simplest form, a shared song. After dessert, spiced apples and coffee, the POWs prepared to leave. Fritz lingered at the doorway. "You have given me something I cannot repay," he said. Helen smiled gently. "Then pass it on someday." She pressed a small package into his hands, a loaf of homemade bread wrapped in a napkin. Only later, unwrapping it back in his bunk, did Fritz realize she'd used Anna's embroidered cloth. That night, the camp seemed quieter than usual. The guards hummed under their breath, half aware of the peace that had slipped through the gates. Fritz sat awake, staring at the bread on his lap. Around him, other prisoners whispered about their own dinners. One family had taught them how to say grace, another had sent them home with candles. They spoke softly, afraid the spell might break if they raised their voices. In his notebook, Fritz wrote, "Tonight the war stopped at one table. Tomorrow it may start again, but now we know it can end." Hayes, reading over his shoulder, didn't interrupt. He only nodded and said, "Merry Christmas, Keller." Sometime after midnight, the wind picked up, rattling the barbed wire like a harp. From beyond the camp, faint church bells echoed across the valley. Anna's voice rose from another barack, singing the same carol, her tone unshaken, clear as starlight. One by one, other voices joined, German, American, human. Hayes stepped outside, the frost biting at his lungs, and looked toward the horizon where the fences glimmered silver. For a moment, it seemed they weren't fences at all, but strings, thin, shining threads stretched between enemies who had finally begun to listen. And somewhere deep inside him, he knew this night would outlast the war itself. Spring 1946 rose gently over Texas, but the world beneath its sky had changed beyond recognition. The war was over, its thunder finally silent, its ghost just beginning to speak. Camp Hearn no longer held soldiers of the Reich, but men who had learned to till soil, mend fences, and write letters they would never send. The barbed wire still shimmered under the sun, though now it looked less like a barrier and more like the fragile skeleton of a vanished storm. Lieutenant Robert Hayes stood by the gate, as trucks rumbled out one after another, carrying the last of the German prisoners home. He felt an ache that surprised him, a hollow in the chest like the aftermath of a long, uneasy friendship. "Funny thing," Sergeant Miller said beside him. "Never thought I'd miss the bastards." Hay smiled faintly. "You don't miss them," he said. "You miss what they turned you into." Among the departing was Friedrich Keller. His face was leaner now, his eyes calmer, like someone who had walked through both fire and forgiveness. He carried little, a notebook, a carved wooden cross, and a folded napkin embroidered with a simple white thread, the same one Helen Carter had wrapped his Christmas bread in. As he climbed aboard the truck, he looked back at the fields, where patches of green were pushing through the thawing earth. America had planted itself inside him without permission. In the weeks before departure, the camp had been a strange purgatory. Men cleaned, packed, and stared at maps of a home that barely existed anymore. Some received letters confirming their towns were rubble. Others found their families alive, but strangers to the men they had become. Hayes watched them wrestle with the quiet. Peace, he thought, was just another kind of war one fought inside. Helen came to see them one last time. The spring wind tangled her hair as she stood by the fence, holding a basket of wildflowers. "You'll plant these when you get home," she told Fritz, pressing a few seeds into his palm. "They're Texas bluebonnets. They're like stubborn soil." He smiled. "Then they'll like Germany." For a moment, words failed them both. There were no grand farewells, no tears, only a silence so full it could break the heart. When the trucks rolled away, the prisoners waved through the dust. Fritz caught one final glimpse of Helen and Mary standing together, their hands raised. The image burned into him. The simple, impossible fact that enemies could look like family if you stared long enough. The journey home was long and bitter. Across the Atlantic, the soldiers found their homeland carved into zones, flags, and hunger. Fritz returned to Hamburg to find his mother's house flattened, his sister lost to the east. He walked through streets that smelled of ash and salt, feeling both survivor and ghost. The bread lines were longer than the train tracks. Yet one morning, as he passed a crumbled wall, he saw a patch of green poking through, wildflowers blue as memory. He knelt beside them and laughed for the first time in years. He wrote to Helen, though he didn't know if the letter would ever find her. "You once said kindness feels heavier than chains," he wrote. "I have carried it across an ocean. I think it has made me free." He tucked the note into an envelope and left it with a Red Cross worker. Months later, on a humid July afternoon, Helen found it waiting in her mailbox, creased, faded, but intact. She read it aloud on her porch, her voice breaking into something between laughter and prayer. Years passed. The world rebuilt itself, slower than anyone hoped, but faster than it deserved. By 1964, Camp Hearn had vanished beneath weeds and rust. Helen's hair was white now, Mary grown and gone. That summer, a stranger knocked on her door, a tall man with kind eyes and an accent softened by time. For a heartbeat, she didn't recognize him. Then she saw the scar on his hand and the way he stood, hat clutched respectfully to his chest. "Mrs. Carter," he said softly, "it's been a long road." They sat on the porch as cicadas hummed their endless hymn. He told her of rebuilding a workshop, of teaching apprentices who'd never seen war. She told him of Mary's children and the church that still sang carols in 2 languages every Christmas. Between them lay decades, yet no distance. "You remember that night?" she asked, "when you said kindness was heavy?" He nodded. "I was wrong," he said. "It was never heavy. It was strong." Before leaving, Fritz placed something on the porch table, a small wooden bird, wings outstretched. "I carved it from the fence post," he said, "the one by the field." She ran her fingers along its surface. "You kept a piece of it all this time?" He smiled. "No, it kept me." They said goodbye beneath a sky that smelled of rain and soil. When he walked away, Helen didn't call after him. She just watched until the road swallowed him whole, her eyes shining with the strange peace that follows understanding. Back in Germany, Fritz visited a small church near the Elbe River every Christmas. On its altar sat a loaf of bread wrapped in a faded napkin from 1944. Each year, he baked it fresh, shared it with whoever came, American, German, stranger. It's not about who you fought, he'd tell them, breaking the loaf. It's about who you sat with when the fighting stopped. He lived to see the wire fences rust into dust, but he never forgot the sound they made in winter when the wind passed through, like the strings of a harp, trembling but unbroken. Sometimes, when the snow fell just right, he swore he could hear voices singing on the Texas plain, blending German hymns and English prayers into one eternal refrain. Lieutenant Hayes, older now and long retired, received a postcard one spring. No return address, just a photograph of bluebonnets blooming against cracked stone. On the back, a line written in careful handwriting. The seeds took root. Hayes read it twice, then looked out across his own yard, where the grass swayed in the warm wind. He smiled, knowing exactly who had sent it. That night, he dreamed of the camp again, of laughter through fences, of bread shared by candlelight, of forgiveness disguised as supper. When he awoke, dawn was breaking, and for a brief, perfect moment, the world felt whole. The story of Camp Hearn faded from textbooks, buried beneath larger wars and louder heroes. But among the men who had lived it, and the families who dared to forgive, the memory endured like a quiet hymn that refused to end. And in every spring bloom, in every small act of grace, the lesson reappeared, simple, stubborn, eternal. Because wars, for all their thunder, end in silence. But mercy keeps on speaking.